Them Alive by Nace. Read by Al Richardson. Chapter 8. He turned and started to run. Then he faced back, stood waiting for the beasts, his feet wide apart, his head high. Instinctively he grabbed his gun and aimed it at the oncoming giants. If he could make his few shots good, if he could kill or even maim them, slow them down, give him time to dive into the sea and head for his boat. He fired at the heads first, but the bullets glanced off harmlessly. The shells of the beasts must be too thick, too hard to be penetrated. He fired his last shells at the bellies, hoping that a softness would show up there, would burst the armour, would plop the great things upon the sand. But the shots fell away this time too, without drawing blood or flesh, without making a scratch upon the tough shells that protected the beasts. Dyke let his eyes sweep the sky with its rolling clouds, the isle with its crawling green death, the three creatures that were bearing down upon him. God, only another tidal wave could snatch him from these monsters now, and that wasn't likely to come. He couldn't outrun these three, or any who would follow them, that was certain. They could rise from the ground and fly wherever they chose, wherever a meal awaited them. If Dyke was to be their repast, he could do nothing to prevent their clawing his body to bits, letting his blood gush out, eating him bite by bite. He braced his feet, set his teeth, tensed the muscles. He had been less than a man for 11 years, but he could die as if he were whole. He would not cry out when the beasts tore his stomach open to share its contents. Where would they tear him open first? Would they smash his head before they sliced into his body, thus ending his life quickly? That was the best he could hope for. But he knew that the mantises seemed to enjoy the screaming, the writhing, the whole useless resistance of their prey. It was almost as if they stood laughing while the victims struggled, before they slashed the body open and began their meal, postponing the horrible death as long as they could. Perhaps this pain of being tortured and torn apart would be less, because he'd gloried in the monster's triumphs over men and animals. He'd pictured the killings on this isle, the streams of blood flowing from torn arteries, the piles of bones that would grow larger as more and more natives died in the grip of the insects. Now he faced three of these enormous beasts, his eyes open. As long as he could, he would enjoy his own dismemberment as he'd revelled in the clawing and bone-crushing and devouring of other men. He would show these freak ogres that one man could die without being a coward, without screaming or shrinking, without running away. He allowed himself one last glance down the island at the seething mass of insects, now trampling each other in their determination to gain a share of the human meat that was trying to run from them, that was screaming, rushing into the water, trying wildly to hide behind each other as the mantises seized them one by one. Dozens of insects now, to every victim they pulled from the cowering knot of people. Dyke came back to his own danger with a jerk of fear. He stood his ground, meeting the three pairs of protruding eyes with his own daring stare. The beasts came on. He felt his heart racing, but he held himself, intense, ignoring the killers. the first mantis reached him. It stopped a few inches from him, its claws outstretched, ready to pin him to the ground. Then, abruptly, it turned and lumbered away. There were two more, and they were not being stopped in their tracks by the first creature's rejection of him. The second mantis reached him, struck out with great clawed hands, scraped the sharp swords down Dyke's arm, bringing a red stain, a stream of blood that grew faster as it poured from him. But the beast drew back angrily, holding up the claw with which it had cut him, shaking the claw, turning from the odour that had been transferred from Dyke to the beast's hand. Suddenly the insect leapt into the nearby water and moved its hand up and down, washing off the evil scent that Dyke's potion had put upon it. Then, returning from the ocean, the mantis passed Dyke by, following the path of the others that crowded around the natives. Dyke faced the third mantis. He knew too well that he was dripping blood from the wound the second beast had inflicted, and that the blood might have more attraction for the things eating him than his smell could repel it. If it did, there was nothing he could do to prevent the creatures devouring him. No human being could resist the attack of such a beast, and Dyke had never been more human than now. The third mantis came close, then reared back on its great feet, turned itself around as if to reach the air that was free of the man's stench. At last the insect trotted away. Dyke let out his relief in gasps that poured over him and through him, leaving him weak for a moment. But in the next breath he was himself again, pulled up to his full height once more, smearing the vile potion that covered him, carrying it into the wounds where the blood was caking. He need have no fear of the mantises now, he assured himself. He'd repulsed 3, 4 counting Slayer. He could walk among them safely now. He made his way down the beach to the spot where the insects were fast reducing the native humans to a pile of bones. He would watch the rest of the slaughter, see the death that would have been his without his special protection. He found 2 mantises fighting over the body of a baby. As Dyke came near, the 2 beasts pulled the little form in 2, one taking the head, the other the body. Blood burst from the little figure, but not for long. The baby only made 2 bites each for the killers. Then Dyke saw the girl, Tanza, in the arms of her man, Miley. The male was trying to shield the female from the onslaught of the creatures, and he was speaking low to the girl, trying to bolster her terror and his own. Dyke understood their language, and he heard the man saying, "I will slide you beneath me, Tanza, my flower. I will slip you into the water. Go quickly and swim under the sea to the white man's boat. Hide there and make no sound. When the white man leaves the isle, you will leave too. You will be safe, my flower. I will see that you are safe." She hid her face in his chest, trembling from her shining black hair to her bare brown feet. "Miley, Miley, why did the white man do this to us?" "I know not, my flower, but he may not have intended this to happen to our people, and the great green things may eat him too, as they are eating those we know and love." Suddenly the man's speech was cut off, as a mantis seized him and dragged him from the girl, sinking its claws deep into his body, one hand slitting the shoulder, the other drawing blood from the broad back. Miley shouted, "Hide, my flower, hide wherever you can, don't let them take you." And the girl slipped behind the last 2 men, the only ones left untouched by the beasts. For a moment she was out of sight, but Dyke thought, they'll find her. If they don't, I will find her for them. I'll pull her from her hiding place and offer her to the mantises. They will adore me for letting them savour the tender taste of women's softness. Now Dyke's attention was claimed by the two mantises that were sharing Miley. They were taking bites out of his body wherever their fancy directed them. Then one of them clawed out an eye, chewed it, and swallowed it, appearing to delight in the flavour. The beast dug out the other eye and ate it with the same relish. Miley lay beneath the monsters, making no protest, only biting his lips to stifle his cries of pain and rage and terror. Blood was gushing from the cuts in the man's shoulder and back. The beast, seeming to see the blood for the first time, began to claw the whole body, releasing more and more blood, bending down to draw it into their great gullets. Two more mantises came to a jarring halt beside the man, and they broke up upon the feast at once. Seeming to sense that the inner parts were the prizes sought by the first two, the second pair snapped off the arms and legs and went running down the beach with the limbs. Dyke knew that the four of them would soon eat all that was edible, even the marrow of Miley's bones. The two who sat upon the man were eating away at his flesh, making bloody inroads into the sturdy shoulders and the fleshy buttocks, sucking up the blood that flowed in torrents from the endless wounds. Then one of the beasts dug his claws into the chest and brought them down the length of the body, laying it open and revealing the inside organs that Dyke knew would be the tastiest of all. Hissing so loudly that the sound echoed and re-echoed across the beach, the two scooped out the heart and liver, the intestines, the stomach, the entirety of Miley's inner body. They scattered the cherished bites about the sand and began to eat into the mass, washing down the man-meat with blood. Other mantises joined them, catching the blood that the two could not reach, grabbing for any bits of flesh or bone that the victors discarded. One of the new insects, evidently hoping to wrest the body from one of the ones who'd claimed it, sank his claws into the leg of one of those who was eating. Instantly the stabbed mantis whirled and struck the intruder with his free leg, breaking its hold and sending the insect rolling upon the bloody beach. In a few seconds there was a whir of wings as a green horde rushed towards the fallen mantis. The brightness of their colour against the blackness of the clouds was startling, almost overwhelming. There seemed to be no end to these soaring insects, as they filled the earth and the sky with their whistling wings, the enormity of their numbers obscuring the horizon. This new group was from the edge of the crowd that had claimed the first natives when they hit the sand. Seeming to know that they could not share the human feast, these mantises took second best, and seized any beast of their own that fell in the scramble. And as the fallen one tried to right himself, but was held back by his bulging belly, a dozen or more of his fellows descended upon him in his helplessness and slit open his abdomen. The beast made no sound, but his legs beat wildly upon his attackers, and his claws tried again and again to sink into the bellies of those upon him. At last his useless efforts were quieted, when 4 mantises planted their kangaroo feet upon him, 2 pinning him to the ground, the other 2 catching his clawed arms. He could fight them no more. He was their prey, and his belly would be emptied into theirs. There, upon the line between the brown ground and the white sand, they tore off his undershell and ripped his stomach and other organs from him, scraping the inside clean, managing, because of their great numbers, to catch almost every drop of the insect's blood, to wolf it down with bites of the food they'd pulled from him. Then, when they were done with him, they dumped him upon the growing pile of mantises' remains that littered the sand. Dyke moved his gaze back to Miley, who must surely be dead by now, bereft of his flesh and organs, sucked dry of his blood. His long body lay upon the white sand, and Dyke watched as 2 mantises clamped onto the man's head. Together, they broke it off and lifted it high. One of them started to run with the head, then went flying aloft, plainly intending to break it and eat the brain by himself. But the second one unfolded his big wings and pursued the one carrying Miley's head and upset his balance, forcing him to land on the sand. Together they smashed the head on a boulder, splitting the skull into pieces. One mantis grabbed a handful of the brain. The other took what was left, like starved things. They chewed the delicacy with hissing delight. Behind them, other insects were scrabbling over the crumbs of flesh, organs and bones that the two had left. Every bone that had not been sucked for marrow was now drained by the newcomers. Miley was not a man any longer. He was a broken pile of discard. Unwanted, even by his killers. Dyke brought his eyes back to the 3 natives who were still alive. The 2 men had been trying to protect Tanza between them, and protect themselves all this time. But they couldn't hold out against the rush of beasts that claimed their lives as food. Dyke climbed onto a large rock, high enough to let him look down upon the feasting beasts. He knew how the men would be eaten. He'd witnessed such a scene many times, but he'd never seen the insects devour a woman. It would be exciting to see. For a man who could never make love to a woman, who had put females from his mind years ago, the sight of one being denuded and dined upon should excite and delight him immeasurably. Dyke could scarcely remember what a nude woman looked like. Eunuchs would waste their minds and emotions on looking upon females, for what was the good of looking when there was nothing more? So the sight of Tanza's beautiful body would stir him, he was sure. Not to a sexual fulfillment, of course. Not to arousal either. But he would feel the satisfaction of curiosity, if nothing else. He would gaze upon a naked woman and take pleasure in the sight before the body was torn to shreds in the claws of the beasts. And now that he knew how elated he became when he saw men eaten, he could look forward to even more wild, primitive excitement when a woman was devoured. One of the giant things broke from the crowd and seized the girl as the men were claimed by the other beasts. The mantis tore the beautiful young girl from the mass of green bodies around him, unfolded his great wings and soared high above the others, with the female in his clawed hands. Dyke followed the flight with his binoculars, missing no part of the creature's strategy. At a distance from the others, but not far from the rock on which Dyke stood, the mantis dropped the girl and then landed on her, holding her helpless by the power of his feet that stretched from her face to her toes. In one sweep of his claws, he disrobed her. But the beast and the girl were not alone for long. Other mantises flew to the scene at once, trying to crowd close for their share of the fresh young body. The girl was crying, pleading hopelessly. "Miley, Miley, where are you? Save me, Miley, save me from these green things." But there was no one to hear, no one to respond to her cries. Dyke felt his own body glowing as he looked upon the loveliness of the girl, the slender brown form, the perfectly moulded breasts that were as comely as the flowers in Dyke's jungle garden. God, what a delicious meal those breasts would furnish for the hungry mantises. What tastiness they would put into the beast's stomach. He stood upon the rock, raised his hands high, placed his feet wide apart, and shouted, "This is beauty. This is happiness. The kind of enjoyment I never expected to experience again. God, I'm hot all over. I'm rich. I'm magnificent. I'm a human being with human joy all over me." As the mantis that was upon the girl's body hesitated, seeming to deliberate on which part of her to eat first, another beast crept up behind, slid carefully and noiselessly around the first mantis, and sent out his claws with lightning swiftness. When he drew back, A beautiful breast was in his clasp, dripping its blood upon the interloper and the white sand beneath them. The breast stood upright in his claws, the brown nipple pointed towards the clouded sky, the rounded flesh quivering in the creature's hold. The mantis raised the breast high, sucking it for the blood that ran from it, drinking every drop he could pull from the soft flesh. Dyke thought, why doesn't he just look at it for a minute? Let his eyes love the sight. But he knew that to a mantis, the girl's flesh, any part of it, was only food and drink. And when the blood was drained from the lovely breast, he plopped it, the whole of the rounded part, into his mouth and began to chew the delectable bites it afforded his appetite. Another creature slipped near now, sliced off the second breast, and was flying away with it. The other creatures shared the girl's arms and legs, while still others caught the blood that flowed from her torn body. She had screamed at first, terrified cries that resounded past Dyke and seemed to fill the entire aisle. But she was only moaning low now, too near death to make loud outcries, too wasted to protest any longer. The mantis who sat upon her did not fight off the ones that had stolen bits from her body. It seemed satisfied to know that the torso was his, that its inner parts would be his meal, the best meal that any such creature could desire. He ran his claws down her face and shoulders, leaving slits that ran red with her blood. Quickly he bent his head to suck the blood, sinking his claws in again and again to squeeze more and more blood from the girl, giving him more and more to suck. Then he sliced the body apart, slitting it from throat to thigh, opening the inside of the girl for Dyke to feast his eyes upon. As fast as the blood gushed, that fast did the beast drink it, thus leaving the organs visible. Dyke studied them, enthralled, excited, gloriously human in his own eyes. Before the mantis rent the organs from the chest and stomach cavities, he bent low over the girl and filled his great maw with all that stamped the body as female. Watching, Dyke thought, God, I think I could eat that part myself. I could never touch a woman's privacy otherwise. Perhaps sometime I can share such a part with one of the beasts when he eats it. He continued to gaze upon the fascinating picture of the one giant insect eating out the inside of the girl, while others pushed close enough to devour her outside. Shoulders, back, hips, arms and legs, all made bites for the many mantises that grabbed them. And the beast that had first claimed her was making the most of his enjoyment of her organs, savouring the heart and liver, the intestines, and at last the stomach, which he stabbed open and spilled upon the sand about him. When the other beasts attempted to steal the delicacy from him, the claimant lashed out with his great claws and sent them flying from him. Then he settled down to his pleasure in eating the half-digested food that he'd ripped from the female stomach, seasoning it with bites from the intestines that he had coiled about himself to ensure ownership. Suddenly a sly beast slipped from the crowd, lumbered past the mantis engaged in devouring the girl's inner organs, and paused at her face. In a moment that Dyke would not have thought a mantis capable of making so fast, the beast tore off the female head and bore it away, scurrying on his mammoth feet to the boulder next to Dyke's vantage point. There he cracked the skull and split it into many parts, spilling the brain upon the rock. He gathered it up to the last wrinkled bit and began to gorge himself with it, hissing his delight at the taste. Many times he ran his claws inside the pieces of skull, as if to be sure he was getting every edible bite. At last Dyke pulled his gaze from the remnants of the girl, knowing there was nothing recognisable about Tanza now, and he said aloud, "Thank you, native woman. You've given me zest and elation today. You've afforded me pleasure, as well as giving the beasts a meal. You've served me well. Your whole village has given me satisfaction. The occupants of other settlements will go into the bellies of these giants in time, but you have the honour of being the first." He looked about the island, gazing in awed amazement at the still seething mass of green giants that seemed not to diminish, no matter how many of them were eaten by the others or trampled to death in the race towards food. He noticed a patch of green in the water, and saw that it was part of the mantis remains, now grown so great that the mass was washing out into the lapping sea. Perhaps sharks and other large fish would dine upon them. Well, the loss of 1,000 beasts a day would mean little to Dyke's plans. Another 1,000, or perhaps double that number, were hatching somewhere below ground and popping to the surface to join the green bodies, the enormous bellies, the clawed hands, every day, in the hope of surviving, if they could find food. A man could hold superiority over any man he chose to intimidate, over any group of men, over any country, if he could rule this throng of giants whose sole purposes in living were eating and sleeping. That moment, Dyke remembered Slayer. He'd left his insect pal, his pet, dare he think of Slayer in that light, aboard the boat locked in the galley. How hungry would the beast be by now? Would he still sit down harmlessly beside Dyke and eat what was offered? Would he trot beside his master without protest? Would he still enter his cage upon Dyke's order? Or would he now hate the man who had locked him up and left him alone? Dyke waded out to the boat and climbed aboard. At once he heard a tremendous rattling and crashing below deck. He dashed to the stairs and ran down to unlock the door that secured Slayer. The scene made him dizzy. The living quarters were a total scramble. The portion spared by the tidal wave now in ruins. Furniture was broken, dishes pulled from the cupboards and smashed. The kitchen was so scattered that Dyke knew no part of it. The refrigerator was overturned and opened, and all the food gone from it. The shelves in the room were stripped bare. Even the flour and sugar and spice cans emptied. Every edible atom had disappeared, eaten, of course, by Slayer. Dyke remembered that the mantis had been asleep when he locked the galley. There had been nothing to assure the beast that anyone would ever come back to free him, and that fear, combined with his natural hunger, could have caused him to make the mess. Would he remember Dyke? And if he did, would he love him or despise him? How long was the memory of a giant mantis? Dyke saw Slayer coming towards him, the beast's clawed hands working, his mandibles chewing and chewing as if his master's flesh were already in his mouth. Dyke thought, God, if he hates me enough, even the smell of me won't keep him from eating me.